Dave Brown sat in his living room in a chair. Across from his chair was an empty couch. Between his chair and the couch was a coffee table with 3 glasses of champagne, 1 full, 2 empty. Next to the table was a bottle of the drink in an ice bucket. Anyone watching him as he relaxed at 7:02 p.m. was a little concerned when he spoke clearly. "That's right. I can hear her car in the driveway." But there were no observers. Dave was alone in the room. He continued to sit with a relaxed look when the front door opened. He couldn't be seen from where he was sitting, but he immediately heard his wife's voice. "Where are you, Dave?" "In the living room, Deb." Dave stood up abruptly as his wife entered the archway. She was holding the hand of a man about 5 years younger than her 49 years. He was thin, medium height, wearing a business suit. In her other hand, she held an orange A4 envelope. Dave, this is Michael." "Michael, this is my husband, Dave." Noticing that she averted her eyes and was generally nervous, Dave took 3 steps and warmly shook the uninvited guest's hand. "I'm very pleased to meet you, Michael. Do you mind if I call you Mike?" "Not at all, sir." "May I offer you a glass of champagne?" "Please, have a seat." Dave watched as the 2 very embarrassed men sat down on the sofa and took the offered glasses after he had filled them. "Cheers. Now would you mind telling this simple soul what's going on?" Deborah and Mike looked over at each other. Mike nodded faintly and squeezed her hand. Dave, it's not really nice to talk about it, so I'll just tell you straight. Michael and I have fallen in love with each other. I'd like a divorce so we can get married." She paused, waiting for her husband's anger. She looked up from the floor to see the look on Dave's face. This was going to be awful. She just knew it. She hadn't expected his face to remain neutral. Unconsciously, she pulled herself a little closer to Mike. "Okay, Deb, are those the divorce papers?" Deb looked up stunned again. She had rehearsed this scene in her head many times, but never, not even in her wildest dreams, had it been like this. She looked at Mike and tried to convey with a look, "I don't know what to say." He took the envelope from Deb and placed it on the table. "Yes, Dave, that's right. I think you'll find them very reasonable. Deb isn't asking you for anything but her car. In the package is her disclaimer of this house, your car, all of your joint assets, and your retirement fund. It's all signed and notarized on our end. I should warn you that I'm a lawyer, so it's okay. But feel free to hire your own representative to put your mind at ease." "Well, I must say, you're both very generous." Deb looked very flustered, like she was waiting for the other shoe to drop. "It was Mike's idea, Dave. In fact, he insisted. He said it was bad enough that he was stealing his wife without taking your hard-earned assets. That was in no way my motivation, but Mike is pretty rich. Even without your money, we'll have more than you and I ever had. Maybe things would have been different if you had gotten a job after the kids were older and helped with the finances, Deb." Deb lowered her eyes again. "So, Mike, is your wife going to give a speech like this, or has she already gotten it?" "No, my wife died 8 years ago. I'm a widower." "I'm sorry to hear that, actually. Thanks, Dave. It hurt like hell for a year or so, but time heals all wounds, as they say. Look, I'm really sorry about this, but I met Deb, and she was like the missing half of my soul. I didn't think I'd ever be whole again. I wanted to tell you that I've been in love with your wife for months." "It's okay, Mike. I never hold a grudge. Please marry her with my blessing." Mike and Deb exchanged stunned looks. Deb because it was not at all what she expected. Then she felt a huge sense of relief. A few months ago, she had led Michael to believe that her marriage to Dave had collapsed, that they were trying to save it, but there was little hope. She knew that the weak point in her plan was Dave's reaction, which might make Mike realize that wasn't quite true. That's why she begged Mike to do it without confrontation. Mike insisted that real men solved problems face to face. He didn't budge. Mike was stunned because even after Deb told him that her marriage was on its last legs, he expected a more angry reaction. From Deb's descriptions, he had formed a mental image of Dave. From what she had said, he was a large, uneducated man used to solving problems with his fists. Mike hesitated at the idea of taking a bodyguard with him tonight, but finally dismissed the thought. In the back of his mind, he thought that if the offended husband hit him a little, it might ease his own conscience. His own sense of propriety was weighing on him. So, Deb, I assume you met Mike at one of your girls' parties? Deb nodded at the coffee table. One of the girls' parties that you assured me were completely harmless and didn't threaten our marriage when I asked. This time, Deb nodded at the floor. I guess that's a lesson for you, Mikey boy. Mikey glanced at Deb. Deb's gaze moved to a section of the floor a little farther away from Mike. So what happens to people now? Come on, Deb, you've got to have a plan. You're giving me the house, so I assume you were going to pack up your stuff and move in with him. I won't get in your way. I was going to do it tomorrow while you're at work. They'll have the locks changed by tomorrow. I'm sure your lawyer friend will agree it's a wise move on my part. It's easier if you do it now, isn't it? Deb and Mike got up to go upstairs. How about we have a talk, Mike? Deb can start packing. Come on, Mike, let's have a chat. I think you owe me at least that much. Deb was torn between wanting to avoid this really uncomfortable situation and having to witness everything that was said. In the end, Mike made the decision for her, sitting back down. Go on, Deb. I promise not to hurt him. I just want to have a chat. Until we're divorced, I'll feel responsible for your safety. I just want to make sure he's taking your best interests to heart. Besides, you made the decision to leave me. I don't see the point in trying to talk you out of it. Our marriage is obviously dead. Both men watched her walk up the stairs and disappear. I have to say, you're being very sensible, Dave. It's all right, Mike. Between you and me, it's been about a year since I've felt Deb's love. I guess that's when you two met. That will be a relief indeed. I have no desire to condemn us both to a loveless marriage. Still, that's very nice of you, Dave. You're welcome, Mike. Now, as a lawyer, you know that whenever you sell a car or a house, you are legally obligated to point out any known defects to the new owners. Mike laughed. Well, slavery is dead, and I don't think Deb would like being considered property that needs a transfer of ownership, but I know what you mean, Dave. Dave smiled, too. He guessed correctly that Mike was a smart and decent man. Okay, now please believe that what I'm about to tell you is not dictated by malice. I just want to point out some of Deb's flaws that may not be obvious after a year of knowing her. Besides, her future happiness is important to me. After all, I've been in love with her for 27 years. I'd also like to share everything I've tried to do to make her happy but obviously failed. That way, you'll know not to waste your time doing the same thing. Mike nodded. He knew that what was about to happen probably wouldn't be entirely altruistic in its intent, but he felt compelled to listen to this innocent man. Right. I assumed Deb was back on the pill? Mike nodded again, feeling a little awkward. It was tantamount to admitting that he'd slept with this guy's wife. Yeah, she's on the pill. I had no idea she ever stopped. She was on the pill when we met, but about 12 months after we got married, she went off them. She said they suppressed her sexual appetite. It's been condoms for me ever since. I hate those damn things. They take away all the spontaneity, and I don't know about you, but I try my best to do without them. Yeah, I know what you mean, Dave. Then, when we decided to stop at 2 kids, she started using condoms as an excuse to not make love as often. I begged her to go back on the pill, but she refused, saying she didn't want to swallow artificial chemicals every day. Since then, our lovemaking has dwindled from several times a week to a few times a month, then to 0 about a year ago. Mike didn't answer anything. He knew that Deb was very careful about what food she ate and opted for chemical-free options whenever possible. Sex with her was still exciting and happened at least 3 times a week, even with the restrictions on their encounters. I know this is very ungentlemanly, Mike, but does she swallow your... Well, you know, Mike found this question very uncomfortable. People of his class didn't talk about such things. He involuntarily averted his eyes. I understand. Yeah. I remember what she was like when Deb and I were dating. Now, please remember that I'm not saying all this with malice aforethought. If I was selling a car that I knew would have to throw a tire out 6 months after I got rid of it, I would have warned you about that too. Deb hasn't swallowed for me since we got married. In fact, I don't think I had a blowjob until about 18 months after we were married, and the doggy style stopped shortly thereafter. We stopped having sex completely until recently. I just got tired of getting knockdowns and stopped asking. Maybe you'd like to write in your journal to keep track of any sudden downfalls every month or so. Dave paused so Mike could add something, but he didn't take the opportunity. Here's another thing I didn't notice until a couple years after we were married. I looked around one day and suddenly realized that almost everything I owned before Deb was gone. The bed, the clothes, the couch, and pictures of old girlfriends, although to be honest, I found them in the attic. I don't know if all women do this, or if it's just Deb, but it was like she wanted to clear the nest of previous female influences. Again, Dave paused, and again Mike was silent. He thought about his new bed and the sheets. Then he remembered his conversation with Deb a week ago about the portrait of his first wife, the woman he had loved tenderly until circumstances cut her out of his life. I hope you're a better judge of her lies than I am, Mike. Just 3 weeks ago, I asked her if she still loved me and if we were good. She looked me straight in the eye and said yes. She did the same thing she always does, looked me in the eye until I broke eye contact. I can't believe it only took 3 weeks to fall so much in love. Mike staggered slightly at the suddenness of this conversation and all the information Dave was trying to get him to internalize. Something about those last 2 sentences was disturbing, but he didn't have time to determine the source. So he focused on the only aspect he could absorb. Don't worry, Dave, I'm a lawyer. I've spent 20 years learning how to recognize liars. They always give themselves away. All right. Chuckles. Again, just some advice that you may or may not take. Watch to see if she takes her rings off when she goes to visit her sister. You may want to check her underwear drawer. I suggest you don't trust her blindly like I did. I thought she was completely incapable of deception, but I'm obviously a dumbass. What else can I say? Oh yeah, if she's true to form, she'll probably stop going to the gym in about 12 months and gain a little weight. At this point, Dave stood up, grabbed a photo album off the shelf, and started flipping through the pages. Here are a couple pictures from 2 years ago when she started going to bachelorette parties. As you can see, her face and ass are plump. But after 2 kids, who would be surprised by that? Mike turned a few pages and saw a chubbier version of his fiancée with far less makeup than he'd ever seen. He was a little stunned at the difference that a little makeup made. He continued flipping through the pages. Is that Deb's mother? I see a strong resemblance. Yes, it is. Wait a minute. As you can see, she was a beautiful woman. That's her when she was in her early 50s. She was a very spectacular woman. Dave picked up another album and opened it to a page. He waited for Mike to state the obvious. Jesus, how old is she here? About 55. She was one of those women who, once they hit menopause around 52 or 53, lost their looks quickly. She took it very gracefully, though, simply saying that she thanked God for the outer beauty she had been blessed with for so long. Dave watched as Mike alternately looked at the 2 pictures. Now, I promise to tell you about all my mistakes that caused her to fail to love me. I suggest you try a different approach. Mine was clearly unsuccessful. Dave paused to pour the champagne. About 25 years ago, she wanted a wedding. I tried to object, saying we'd be better off investing in a house, but she said that if I had faith that we'd be together forever, I wouldn't save money for such an important day for her. If you want, I can find a copy of our wedding vows for you. From memory, we hold to the traditional love, honor, obedience, and rejection of all others. If you try something different, you might do better than me. Not really important to you, but don't bother working your fingers to the bone and doing a bunch of shit over time so she can get the flash house she's always wanted. It clearly wasn't holding her legs together. In fact, we're probably here because I refused to pay for the facelift she wanted, preferring to invest in our retirement. She can be pretty persistent when her heart is set on something. You've probably noticed. Mike nodded, wondering if this characteristic of Deb's was really the wonderful quality he'd thought it was until now. So, I thought in vain that I was being smart by asking her out every month to discuss anything about me or our relationship that was starting to irritate or cause the slightest resentment. Our last date was less than a month ago and she didn't say anything. A man of your caliber, I'm sure he could come up with something better. At that moment, Mike noticed the light in Dave's eyes and suddenly realized what he was up to. Nevertheless, he made some good points. The idea that Deb was completely free of guile was very much at odds with some of his own thoughts lately. He was so taken aback by Dave's obvious amusement at the whole scenario that he ignored his internal alarm again. Dave kept talking, even though they were both obviously aware that Deb had stopped coming down the stairs, being within earshot. Keep an eye out for lists of things she's going to remove from the house. That's a good hint that she's already treating the marriage with contempt and is looking for a replacement. It won't change much of what happens, but it will allow you to prepare for the endgame she has planned and encourage you to start digging for other evidence. Mike blinked and looked around. For the first time, he saw 3 champagne glasses and a bucket of ice. Clear evidence that all 3 people present knew about tonight's meeting in advance, when it should have been just the 2 of them. His usual, very observant nature missed the clues. Dave watched Mike's eyes run. Yeah, I knew it was going to be today. Deb called me twice today to make sure I'd be home by 7. Mike tore his gaze away from Dave and looked over to where Deb was halfway down the stairs. Deb resumed her descent, clearly pretending not to have heard the last few minutes of the conversation. Dave, do you want to talk about which of the family photos I can take now or some other time? Dave ignored her and leaned across the couch from her, keeping his eyes on his rival. The last thing I did wrong was forgive Deb when I first caught her cheating on our marriage. What? Asked Mike. No, came out of Deborah's lips as she retreated into the kitchen. Yes, it was right after our second child was born. I forgave her because she and our counselor convinced me it was an isolated mistake caused by postpartum depression. I often wondered if I had been too soft on her. Maybe a harder line at the time could have prevented a recurrence. I justified my actions by saying that I was acting in the best interest of the children. They grew up to be good people, so hopefully I did the right thing by them. For her sake, I hope you'll be generous enough to forgive her when your time comes. I don't know what to say, Dave. You don't have to say anything, Mike. Just answer me. Look into your heart and ask yourself if you would forgive your late wife if you found her sleeping with someone in your own bed. For the first time, Mike lost his composure. He leaned forward. Out of the corner of his eye, Dave noticed some movement and saw a pale-faced Deborah standing in the kitchen doorway. My wife would never disrespect me like that. We loved each other, too. Wait a minute. You said, the first time Deb cheated on me, were there other times? No, just 2 times. Then and now. Deb jumped out of the kitchen. No, she screamed desperately. I'm done packing, Mike. If you take my suitcases, we can get out of here right now. Calm down, Deborah. The last was said in a quiet but unrelenting voice. Surprisingly, the voice was Mike's. Deb stopped like a dumbfounded woman. Mike turned to Dave again. Deborah assured me that she wasn't cheating because you had an open marriage, Dave. Did she look you in the eye when she said that, Mike? Mike looked at Dave, then at a shrinking Deb, then back at Dave. Dave saw in Mike's eyes the sudden realization that he wasn't as good at recognizing liars as he thought he was. What did she tell you about the state of our marriage, Mike? She said it had been shaky for a few years, Dave. That you'd been seeing a counselor for a while, but there was no hope for either of you. Dave didn't say anything back, just stared at Mike as he continued talking to fill the void. Now I guess that doesn't really fit with what you said about still going on dates and asking if she loved you. Dave continued to look Mike in the eye again. He chose the exact moment when Mike realized he was being played like a complete sucker. An expression easily interpreted as self-disgust flashed across the little man's face. Mike turned to the frozen Deborah. You goddamn bitch. You've turned me into the man I despise the most. A man who has other men's wives without their husbands knowing. Upon hearing that statement, Deb dropped to her knees. Mike was suddenly speechless and interested in the same area of the carpet that had so fascinated Deb earlier. Finally, he pulled himself together and looked at Dave again. Please, Dave, you have to believe me. I had no idea. Don't worry, Mike. I told you she was a good liar. God, I wish she'd told me we had an open marriage. Then I might have slept with her last year. The deliberate use of humor in a very tense situation seemed to work. Mike relaxed a little, but remained silent. Did that mean the engagement was off? Yes, definitely. In that case, I want you to meet a couple people. John, Alice. At that moment, the door to the basement opened. Hearing a noise, Mike turned around and saw a young man and woman approaching. Mike, I want you to meet my son John and my daughter Alice. They were listening to our conversation through a microphone. John graduated from law school 2 years ago, and Alice earned her degree this year. John and Alice shook a confused Mike's hand. John then picked up an envelope from the table and began to nonchalantly examine its contents. Dave turned to his daughter. Do you believe me now, Alice? Yes, Dad, there's no doubt she's a cold, conniving schemer. All eyes turned to the moaning. Deb was still on her knees, but now her head was on the floor. Sensing the silence, she lifted her head and was met with 4 accusing stares. She jumped up and ran out the front door. No one made the slightest attempt to stop or follow her. John calmly finished going through the contents of the envelope. Everything seems to be in order, Dad. Good, thank you. Now, who wants a beer? I think I should go. You stay here, little Mikey. There's still some things we need to figure out. Like what? Well, I can forgive you for sleeping with that stupid bitch. Like she's got an open marriage and all. But I have to decide whether to rip your head off and spit in your neck for trying to steal her. Mike looked at the other man, noting that the other man was a head taller and much larger. Then he looked into his eyes and saw a familiar glint. Dave decided to calm down a bit. John is doing what you do, Mike. By now, Mike was no longer surprised that Dave knew so much about him. How's your current job, John? The hours are crap and the pay sucks. Don't you want to come and work with me? Hell yeah. Dave smiled. Then that leaves the issue of supporting my ex-wife until she gets a job. She doesn't have a house or money anymore. With a growing sense of relief, Mike entered the new topic. I'm really sorry, Dave. As soon as she lied to me, she broke the implied contract we had. In the event of a breach of contract, ownership passes to the previous title holder. Yeah, but morally? Don't talk to me about morality. I'm a lawyer. John, do you have a dictionary? I'm a little vague on what it actually means. Everyone laughed. No, seriously, Mike. I think you should look after her until she gets back on her feet. If you play your cards right, you can pretend you're thinking about keeping her and cheer yourself up in bed for a while. No, I can't do that, but I'll make sure she's okay. Not for her, for you. I admire craftsmanship wherever I see it, and tonight I was totally outclassed, wasn't I? Have you ever considered a career in law, Dave? The way you took me off balance, passing off negatives as positives and not giving me time to think, was worthy of the best prosecutor I've ever seen. Dave smiled modestly but didn't say anything back. He loved his job and the people who surrounded him at work. So, 4 beers then. For the first time ever, Dave looked away, until he was sure that the tears that had accumulated in the corners of his eyes were gone. He would not make eye contact again. By this time, Deborah Brown was already 700 meters away, walking fast and accelerating as if her heels were toast. She sat in front of me, trying to hide her tension. During the first meeting, I had learned that Louisa was a civil servant, well regarded by her superiors, a successful woman, but there was something wrong with her relationship with her husband. That's what they both thought. But the wife had more trouble understanding than the husband. Louisa, how long have you and Harry been together? I decided to reassure the woman who was very nervous. Me been together for about 22 years. We have 2 children, a son and a daughter. They are already in college, so Harry and I are home alone. Louise answered me hastily, even to my unasked questions. I couldn't understand what exactly this woman was hiding about this world. Do you feel lonely because the children have left home? I marked down in my notebook the strange sense of guilt I could feel in Louise's words and actions. What are you saying? Why am I lonely? I'm at work. We have a good team, friendly. And at home, I have Harry. Louise immediately became defensive, although the very reminder of her husband turned out to be quite disturbing. Do you love your husband? I decided to test my theory. Yes, I love him. She closed her eyes and whispered her confession. Are you cheating on him? I dropped the question without warning. What? I would never do that to him. Those were sincere words, but there was an audible alarm in them. I'm sorry, I just had to ask. But I want to ask you how you're doing in bed. I believed Louise would be sincere here, too. We're sleeping together. I think it's an age thing. I don't always want to do it with him, was a strange answer. A woman who loved her husband refused to make love to him? Why? My direct question demanded a direct answer. I'm not sure of myself. There are just too many young, beautiful women. And Harry, he's better than me. And I guess it's okay. Louise wiped away a tear. Did Harry tell you that you're not pretty? I tensed up, waiting for an answer. No, not at all. He's always admiring my body. Says I'm the most beautiful. But I'm over 50. Louise tensed again. When did you start having trouble having sex? Even a non-expert could see that the woman was lying. I don't have a problem having sex. I'm sorry, I'm not interested in it. Louise looked at the chair where her husband had sat last time. I asked about the time, Louise. I was beginning to develop a note of hostility towards this woman. 6 months ago. We stopped sleeping as husband and wife 6 months ago. Louise was surprising me more and more. And what happened 6 months ago? I tried to force out some information. I was told my husband was having an affair on the side. And now there was an expression on her face that signaled not anger, but guilt. And you think he's cheating on you? I needed to hear her opinion. I don't know. He never comes home later than usual. He hasn't changed his behavior. I can't smell another woman's scent from his clothes. There are no new callers on his cell phone that he talks to often. There are no messages in his mail from any acquaintance. But I can't be sure. The detectives hired haven't... Louise could barely hold her breath. She looked at me a little annoyed. Her voice, on the other hand, became a little sharper. You're going through his phone and reading his mail. And what could the detectives possibly know? I wouldn't have thought Louise was capable of such a thing. But this woman didn't trust her husband. Yes, I'm jealous of him. I check his cell phone every night, and the surveillance has determined that he is faithful to me. The quiet reply stunned me. But you could ask him. I'm sure he wouldn't lie to you. I hoped for their reconciliation. I'm afraid to hear that he has someone else. I'm scared he's going to leave me for some whore who hangs around him at work. And then I was told about him. Yes, the nature of her fear was clear to me. But from their first visit to my office together, I had immediately identified Louise as the cause of the problem. And who had led this woman to think of her husband cheating on her? Who told you that? I tried to find someone to blame for their problems. It doesn't matter. Louise didn't give away her secrets. You know, it's better to know the truth, bitter but true, than to suffer. But I want to meet Harry at the next session. Is there anything you can do for me? I want you to smile at your husband. I want you to show him that you love him. I tried to motivate Louise into action. Gary turned up for his session on time. He was precise about everything. Well, that's his main job. He's a math professor at a prestigious university. Harry, how long have you and Louisa been together? I decided to see his reaction to the question. 22 years, a whole 22. Harry smiled but didn't elaborate on his question. And how do you remember your marriage? I saw his smile, but I wanted to know the reason for that reaction. We were multifaceted. Sometimes we quarreled, but always made up. We have beautiful children, a son and a daughter. I don't control her at work or outside the office. I trust her completely. This is her second marriage, but I never reproach her for it. And yes, I am almost happy. Lately, though, something has happened, and we can't find a way out. That's our life together. Harry was oddly more interested in finding a way out of the crisis. Do you know what the cause of your differences are? Have you talked to Louisa about them? I made my notes in preparation for my meeting with Louise. I'm trying to find answers, but Louise won't let me into her world. I've found myself outside her orbit. Harry was brutally honest. Do you think she might be cheating on you? I tested different ways of dealing with the question. I don't know. Like I said, this is her second marriage, but she doesn't seem like a cheater. Yes, she has a lot of men at work and she's a very beautiful woman, but I don't think she's having an affair with anyone. Harry only pressed his lips together bitterly. You haven't looked at her phone or email? I was walking on thin ice. As I told you before, I have no control over her. I don't think that would be wise. We've been together for so many years. I was surprised at this man's confidence. Could you cheat on her? I was afraid of hearing a bad answer. I work at a university. I have plenty of female students and female co-workers, but it wouldn't even occur to me to look at someone else with desire. You see, Louise is my whole world to me, and my cheating would shatter that world. Harry looked openly at me. Has Louise changed since our lessons? I wanted to see if the woman had been doing my assignments. No, she thinks it's an age thing with us, and we have to overcome things on our own. And this was something I didn't expect to hear. How do you behave around your wife? I was at a loss to guess. I love her. I always tell her about it, demonstrate it, and I always will. Harry leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. Harry, when did Louise's changes to you start? I needed to find a reason. About 6 months ago. Harry smiled bitterly, but here was the coincidence in time that surprised me. And what happened 6 months ago? I realize you can't remember everything, but the most important moments you can remember. I was walking on very thin ice. The highlights? I released another one of my books. Our son turned 18. My longtime friend Jack came to visit. He stayed at our house for a week. It was our family's traditional Jack Week. I signed a new contract for a new book. I don't seem to have forgotten anything. Harry smiled, remembering those events. Does your friend come to visit you often? I suddenly realized I shouldn't have put that question, but it was too late to call it off. Jack doesn't visit us very often, most often for his son's birthday. He gets a week's vacation from his employers, so he spends his entire vacation at our house. Even Lisa takes her well-deserved week off to cook and just relax. They go out a lot. Louise shows him around the city. Harry smiled again at the memories, and I decided not to touch the sore subject any further. I'm not a detective, but I can logically calculate different options. We may need to spend the next class with the two of you. I'll need to ask you the same questions. But remember, you have to fight for your happiness. I suppressed the temptation to yell at Louise. Okay, we'll be at your place in a week. I think we should sort ourselves out. Harry stood up, and after saying goodbye, he left. But to my surprise, they didn't show up for our meeting. What's more, my secretary couldn't get in touch with them. All phone calls went to voicemail. It wasn't until later, on the afternoon news, that I learned that a prominent university professor had committed suicide. The man had thrown himself under a subway train. No one could help him. Surveillance cameras at the station showed that the man had not been forced. A week later, I received a strange letter. On the envelope was my work address. In the place where the sender's address should have been, there was only the name Harry. I fought the temptation. The man's posthumous confession could only confirm my suspicions. Sitting at home with an unchanged portion of my whiskey, I decided to give in to temptation and opened the envelope. There were copies of 3 DNA tests with the conclusions of the specialists. Samples 1 and 2 belonged to relatives. Samples 2 and 3 belonged to relatives. Samples 1 and 3 belonged to unrelated people. No, one didn't even have to ask oneself what that meant. The conclusion was obvious. Harry had found out that his son had a different father. It didn't take a mathematical genius to figure out exactly who the boy's biological father was. But why did Louise continue to let the man she had once had an affair with into her home? Or was the affair never ended? I picked up the letter that was in the envelope, handwritten in neat masculine handwriting. In our bedroom, I found what I was looking for. Louise kept a diary a long time ago, ever since the day she and I dated. Several notebooks. Yes, I should have noticed it earlier. Jack was more than a friend to her. So they started their own Jack Week. Louise and Jack denied their spouses' sex issues so that they could belong only to each other. All these years, I've seen things I've never been able to unravel. But it's too late now. It's too late to fight, to divorce. But I've made my choice. I've changed my will, according to which most of my savings will go to my daughter. The rest will go to my son. I continue to consider him my son. I've even changed my insurance policy. My daughter will now get the money. I haven't closed my and Louise's bank accounts, but I have transferred most of my fees to a separate account that will also go to my children. I've kept our joint medical policy for Louise, although I don't even know what that will do for her. It turns out she often used it to treat her lover. I gave the contract for the new book, the material for which I had already gathered, to my deputy, who was the only one who knew about my problem, and I refused to be a co-author on this project. Let all the glory go to this young woman who lives her life entirely in science. My choices are difficult, but I'm not willing to go through the hell of divorce. I don't want anyone to know that I have become the owner of huge horns in 22 years. I am also sending you a check for your sessions. We were signed up for 20 courses, and I am paying for all of them. Maybe my wife would like to tell you about her experiences because I left her the test results and a little message. Thank you. May all be well. I put the letter on the table and filled my glass again. I needed to calm myself down. We never got to meet Louise. She, even knowing that Harry had paid for the entire course of our sessions, was unwilling to make any reconciliation with herself. Had she been able to understand herself and open up to her husband, she could have saved her loving man from death. Her desire to blame her husband for her adultery was strange. Did she really want to shift the blame for all the problems in their family onto Harry? But honestly, who needed all that explanation? Jack's weeks hadn't been a random choice. Sooner or later, Harry would have seen that he had little in common with his son. I wonder how Louise reacted when the will was read out. And did the children realize what such a change meant? Don't get me wrong, but to be honest, I would like to gloat because she is the one who deserved such a punishment. Anne and her sister Joan were returning by car from their parents' house. John, Anne's husband, usually drove the car, but he was held up at work. Anne smiled at Joan and said, "I had to drive the Miata." Joan shook her head and said, "And where would we put all our stuff?" Anne loved her Miata convertible. She named the car Mary and was inseparable from her for 12 years. The car was both her parents' 18th birthday present and her high school graduation. Anne looked at Joan and said, "John and I always have only the essentials with us." At the traditional family reunion, everyone asked about John. Anne's father was especially disappointed that John couldn't make it. Anne and Joan were 2 of 5 daughters. Their father had no sons. That said, no one knew which of the sisters was the favorite daughter. But there was no doubt about who was his favorite son-in-law. John called and apologized, promising to visit them soon. John was tall, dark-haired, well-tanned, and handsome. He was also smart, loving, and funny. He worked in the distribution center of an international company in Fredericksburg, Virginia. They had been together since 9th grade. John and Anne attended colleges that were 200 miles apart but still stayed together. John always joked that they went to different colleges together. Anne looked out the window. She remembered all the kids asking about Uncle John. John loved the children, and they loved him. He was their favorite playmate at every family reunion. Joan looked at her sister. She felt something was bothering her. Finally, she said, "Okay, let's get it over with. What's going on with you?" Anne continued to stare out the window. Joan looked away from her for a few minutes, but then she told her sister again, "You'll feel better if you share what's bothering you with someone. You know you can tell me anything." Anne lowered her head and said, "I'm having an affair." Joan was shocked and fell silent. Coming to her senses, she asked, "Are you cheating on John? Oh my God, Anne, why?" Anne looked up with tears in her eyes and said, "I don't know why myself." Joan reached out to take her sister's hand. "Tell me everything," she asked. Anne answered, "It started 6 months ago, right after our family meeting. It was David Stevens from my office. He'd been flirting with me for a couple years, and one day I just said yes." Joan clarified, "Is this the same David Stevens I met at one of your picnics last year? The same David Stevens you warned me to stay away from? The man you called an asshole who chases every skirt?" "Yes," Anne said. "I thought I'd be safe from him. There's no way I could fall in love with someone like that." Joan asked, "But you fell in love with him?" Anne shook her head and said, "No, of course not. It's just that I used to think he was an asshole. Now I know that for a fact. I broke up with him on Friday at lunch." Joan looked at her sister. "It was lunch in a hotel room?" Anne looked angrily at Joan and said, No, it was in a restaurant." Joan asked, "You had sex with him, but you didn't like him? That doesn't make any sense, Anne. I have to ask again, why?" Anne hesitated for a moment, then answered, "I think I freaked out when I saw John playing with the kids 6 months ago. We were just discussing having children of our own. The house was almost paid off. Our cars are paid off. We have no credit card debt. Joan, we have almost $20,000 in a college fund for kids who weren't even born. We plan to really do it when we turn 30. John is 30 now. I'll be 30 in 2 months." Joan asked, "You don't want kids?" Anne replied, "I always thought I did, but now I'm scared. I've been afraid of becoming a mother. I'm afraid of losing us, me and John. I'm afraid of losing myself. I love my job. I should have given up the pills 6 months ago." "Anne, does John know all this?" Joan asked. Anne shook her head sadly. Then Joan asked another question. "You didn't give up the pills?" Anne said quietly, "At first, I didn't want to stop taking them. After I started with David, I had to stay on them. I couldn't risk getting pregnant with him." Joan got angry. "You slept with him without condoms. You know his history. How could you not think about protection?" A weeping Anne said, "He doesn't like rubbers. I don't like them either." Joan said to her sister, "John thinks you haven't taken birth control in 6 months. You need to stop this madness. You need to tell John everything and beg his forgiveness. He loves you, Anne. He can forgive you, but only if you're honest and upfront with him. You know, John, a secret will kill your relationship." Anne replied, "No, Joan, I could never tell him. Do you remember Bob and Carol Wilson?" Joan nodded. Anne continued, "Bob was having an affair with someone from work. Carol found out, and their lives have been a living hell ever since. John and I had several conversations about Bob's infidelity. He couldn't understand how someone in love could cheat. I tried to defend Bob. I told John that if they really loved each other, they could save their marriage. I told him that they could put the pieces of their mosaic together. This affair might even make their marriage stronger. But Joan, I can tell you for a fact that he doesn't look at it that way." Joan continued to listen to her sister. She realized that Anne was just digging herself an ever deeper hole. She asked Anne, "Tell me about David Asshole Stevens. I can't believe that sex with him could be so unpleasant." Anne replied, "Sex with David is normal. He's aggressive in bed. But with David, everything was done hastily. And again, we never had much time to get together. With John, it's much better. It was always great." Reflecting aloud, Anne said, "I tried to make David more like John. Why would I do that when I already have John? Unfortunately, John was becoming more and more like David in bed. We haven't had all-day lovemaking in a couple months." Joan was disturbed by this news. She asked, "Anne, when did your sex life with John start to change? Was it around the same time you and John started discussing the Wilsons?" Anne hesitated. "I think so." Joan remarked, "The John I know doesn't like gossip, but I think he tried to get you to end your affair for the first 3 months, and for the last 3 months you've been defending your affair." The realization struck Anne. Oh God, no. Does he really know? Does John know about David? Anne picked up her cell phone. She needed to talk to John. She needed to hear his voice. The call went straight to voicemail. Joan asked, "How did he communicate with you when you talked to him last night?" Anne realized that John hadn't called last night. They always talked before going to bed. Even when they were separated by thousands of miles, they talked. Anne said to Joan, "He didn't call me last night." Joan asked, "Tell me about your last communication. Did he seem okay?" Anne replied, "He seemed normal. We talked about Bob and Carol again. Joan, he said it was too late for them. He said that if Bob had come clean, maybe he would have had a chance." Anne continued, "We talked about Mary, about my car. He asked me if I would fix it if the windshield cracked. I told him that of course I would. Then he asked me if I would fix it if I had fender damage. I told him yes. He then asked me, would I fix it if the car was totaled in an accident? I told him no. I remember telling him that the car would never be okay again. It might look new, but it would never drive like it used to. And he told me that Bob had ruined his marriage to Carol." Joan was crying now too. She said to Anne, "Pull yourself together. We don't know for sure what he knows, but we do know that you absolutely have to talk to him." Joan pushed a little harder on the gas pedal. They pulled into the driveway of Anne's house. There was a light on the front porch, but John's SUV wasn't there. Anne shouted fearfully, "He's not here!" Joan judiciously replied, "He could have parked in the garage. Open the garage door." Anne knew his car wouldn't be in the garage. Their 2-car garage was reserved for her Miata and his 1988 BMW 325C convertible. She used her cell phone to open the garage door. The two women looked at the nearly empty garage. John's convertible was not in the garage. Anne's Miata was gone, but there was something in its place. In the spot where the Miata had been parked before, lay a 4-by-4-foot mound of mangled red metal. On top of it lay a large envelope of heavy paper. Anne knew the contents. She had prepared many such packages herself at her job. On top of the envelope was a metal emblem that read, Mary. That emblem had been on the back of her car when they replaced the Mazda emblem with Mary a few years ago. On one of the emblem's screws hung John's wedding ring. Next to the emblem were her birth control pills. Anne picked up a paper lying to the side. It was a handwritten note addressed to her. She read the short text. Dear Anne, I'm sorry that everything I did wasn't enough for you. I hope you and David will be happy together. I just wanted you to respect me enough to tell me that to my face. Your Mary is that metal junk you see in the garage. Let me know if you can put the pieces of that mosaic back together again. I've always loved you, Anne, and I will always love you. I hope you find the happiness you're looking for in your life. John. R.S. You have some kind of STD. Please get yourself tested. Our doctor says it can be pretty nasty if left untreated. You need to see him on Monday. He says you will need to tell the health department about your lovers. Anne handed Joan the note and sat down on the floor. She couldn't cry. She couldn't make a sound. She couldn't move. Joan sat down beside her and held her tightly against her. Anne's cell phone rang. She answered it without looking at the caller ID. John? She cried. No, it's your mother, came a voice from the phone. Her mother continued, John just left us. He brought your father some parts for the car and said he came to say goodbye. He didn't want to tell us what happened. He said you should tell us yourself. Why is he leaving you, Anne? Anne told her mother, I had an affair. I slept with another man. Anne's mother was silent for a few moments. Then she said disappointedly, I can't believe you could do something like that. Is Joan with you? Anne replied, Yes, Joan is here. Her mother then said, I have to go. Your father needs me. Anne, he's crying. I've been married to him for 40 years, and this is only the second time in my life I've seen him cry. Joan helped Anne into bed. Anne got up in the night and went downstairs to sleep on the couch. She couldn't sleep in their bed without him. The two of them spent a restless night. The next morning, Anne was up and ready to face a new day. She took a shower and woke Joan up. Anne said, I have a busy day today. Will you help me? Anne knew her sister's answer. She thought about John. He had no real family to lean on. His parents had died in a car accident 20 years ago. He had one brother, but that one was in the military and they only saw each other once every couple years. The fact that he was facing this alone broke her heart. The sisters went from the house straight to the doctor's office. He asked the necessary questions as professionally as he could. Anne felt guilt in every answer she gave. The doctor wrote several prescriptions to treat her venereal disease. Then they went to Anne's workplace. She talked to James Johnson. He was the partner she worked most closely with. She told him the whole story. He told her to take a week's vacation. The firm would represent her in the divorce. He promised to solve any work problem while she was away. As she left Johnson's office, she headed down the hallway to where she saw David Stevens talking to a couple of paralegals. When he turned toward her, Anne kicked him in the groin with her knee. She picked up a heavy copy of Black's Law Dictionary and kicked him in the head. David Stevens flew across the table and landed with a clatter. Anne said, Expect a call from the health department. Anne turned around and saw Mr. Johnson. She said to him, I apologize for the mess. Will the firm represent me if I am arrested? Johnson smiled and nodded, then said, There will be no police report. Then they went to John's workplace. Anne knew that John had an automobile trailer and had taken all the possessions he had with him. He must have left the neighborhood, but she had to find him. She went to John's boss's office. Anne had met Fred Jennings at several company events. He was a good boss and a good man. His secretary was Doris Miller, the nurse of the company. Doris saw Anne and said, Hi, Anne. Fred has been expecting you. Please come in and have a seat. Anne saw the sadness in her eyes. Anne and Joan entered Fred Jennings' office and sat down in the chairs offered to them. Anne aggressively said, I need to know where John is. Does he still work here? Fred calmly replied, Anne, you have no enemies here. I've always liked you, and I think very highly of John. He said you could come here. He authorized me to answer all your questions. Fred continued, John has moved to Charleston, Scotland. He's the new Southeast Regional Manager. This is a big promotion for him. We first talked to him about this move 6 months ago, but John turned it down. He said you two were going to have kids and he wanted you to be closer to your family. He also knew that the new position would require a lot more time to work. Then, about 2 months ago, he asked me if the position was still open. He said that the pay raise would allow you to quit your job. He also thought you two might want a change of scenery. Fred stopped and looked at Anne. He added, "John is a great worker, but he's a bad liar. He told me what was really going on between you two. I had hoped you two would move in together, and I'm so sorry it didn't work out. John isn't scheduled to report to the new office until next Monday. I can give you the address and phone number of our branch office there, but I don't know where he's staying in Charleston." Anne stood up and reached for Fred's hand. She said, "Thank you, Mr. Jennings." Fred replied, "Good luck, Anne. We all wish you nothing but the best for the future." The sisters went to lunch at a small diner down the street from her office. As they ate, Anne felt the stares of some of the members of the legal community. She knew there would be a lot of rumors and gossip, but she didn't care now. Anne told her sister, "He gave me every chance, didn't he? He was almost begging me. Why didn't he just say so? Why didn't he ask me to stop?" Joan looked at her sister. "Did you ever give him any sign that you might stop?" They ate and went back to the law office. Deborah Mayton, the best divorce attorney in the firm, was assigned to her case. Deborah read the divorce petition and the proposed property settlement. She looked at Anne and said, "This property division agreement is extremely favorable to you. He leaves you with a house that seems to be almost paid off. In addition, he has only withdrawn $25,000 from your joint investment and bank accounts. You get to keep your 401 account. The arrangement is better, I think, than we could have ever hoped for." Deborah paused to watch Anne's reaction, then continued. "Your husband is asking for the following. He will take the 2 cars he drives, a 1988 BMW 325 IC and a 2018 Toyota RAV4. He will keep his 401 account. It looks like it's a little bigger than yours. He also withdrew $5,000 from your main checking account and all the money from an investment account he called the Baby Fund. That fund has $20,000 in it. The value of your other investment accounts is more. The last item is a request for you to return your maiden name." Joan hugged a sobbing Anne. Deborah Mayton felt a tear roll down her face. She had always liked Anne. She was familiar with her husband, and they seemed so perfect together. Deborah had seen so many failed marriages in recent years. She wondered how anyone could make such a marriage work if these two had failed. She knew it was unprofessional, but went around her desk and hugged Anne. The 3 women cried for lost love. There was nothing to fight about in a divorce. Deborah brought up the destruction of Anne's car, but John's attorney pointed out the unequal division of property. Mayton sought counseling, but the request was denied. John worked out of the area, and those sessions would have been impossible. 45 days later, Anne found herself in a conference room to finalize her divorce proceedings. It was the first time she had seen John since he had left her. He tried to look nice and calm, but he clearly wasn't. With Anne were her parents and Joan. Her parents had insisted on being there, but Anne wasn't sure if they showed up for her or John. Anne and John greeted each other politely and courteously. Anne asked, "John, can we talk privately for a minute?" John nodded and turned to the lawyers. "Can we have a few minutes in one of the conference rooms?" Deborah led the couple down the hall to an empty room. Anne began, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I hurt you. I've been trying to figure out why I cheated on you. The only answer I have is that I was afraid. I was afraid of the changes coming in our lives." John shook his head and said, "And I was excited about the changes coming in our lives. I thought we had the same dreams for our future. Do you remember what we promised each other before we got married?" Anne nodded slowly and answered, "We promised to always talk to each other. We promised that we would never let anything come between us. We promised to always tell each other the truth." Anne said sadly, "I was afraid the children would hurt us, you and me as a couple. I was afraid they would ruin our relationship." John responded sharply, "You thought children would hurt our relationship? You cheated on me with another man to fix our relationship?" John calmed down and continued, "If you had told me your fears, we could have faced them together. The truth is, you didn't want to face change. You did the one thing you knew would end our marriage." Anne said, You should know that David was never a threat to our marriage. John looked at Anne and replied, I know he wasn't a threat. You were a threat to our marriage. I'm sorry I couldn't save us from you. She knew he was telling the truth. There was nothing more to say. Anne walked over to John and hugged him. John returned the hug, and the two former lovers snuggled together for several minutes. They left the room and went back to their lawyers and family. The papers were signed quickly. As they were about to leave, John turned to Anne and gave her a key and a piece of paper. He said to her, I have some of your things in the storage room. You need to go there today or tomorrow before your lease expires. John hugged Anne's mom and shook her dad's hand. He promised to visit them as they asked. He hugged Joan and thanked her for being there for Anne. John turned and walked out of Anne's life. Anne wanted to just go home, but her father insisted they go to the warehouse. Her father opened the door, and the four of them stared at the contents. There was the Mary, parked there in all its glory. The Miata looked like it had just been waxed. Anne checked the back of the car for the emblem. It was in place. The car had the personal license plates. Anne, Miata. Anne read the note she found on the windshield. Anne, this is the real Mary. The car you found in the garage was an old wreck I found in a junkyard. I wanted you to feel my pain, but I couldn't take Mary away from you. Remember when we made 2 emblems for that car? I hope you two have many more happy days together. Love, John R.S. Mary needs to be insured before you get behind the wheel. Anne's father said, John called me 2 days ago and told me about your car. He wanted to make sure you got it home safely. Anne drove the Miata home. She decided to take a chance and drive 2 miles. She put the Mary in her usual spot in the garage and turned off the ignition. Her family found her crying. They were waiting for her in the living room, but they knew she needed to cry. The funny thing about life is that you often relive an event that you think you can never relive. Anne went on with her life and dove headfirst into her work. A couple years after her divorce, she applied and was accepted to Georgetown Law School. She rarely drove her precious Mary. The joy she had once felt was gone. She preferred to drive the Toyota Corolla she bought after John left. She often talked to her parents. When she asked, they would tell her they were talking to John. Anne wondered if he ever asked about her, and the answer was usually in the negative. The day of the family reunion approached, and Anne spoke to her parents again. Her father asked, Is it okay if I invite John to the reunion? She paused and replied, Dad, it's been almost 5 years. I know how close you two were. I don't mind if you invite him. Her father said, Even if he brings someone? Anne closed her eyes and said, Yes, Dad. At the family reunion, Anne watched John walk into the yard. The last 5 years had been very kind to him. He looked happy. John was accompanied by a pretty woman and 2 children. The children appeared to be between 8 and 12 years old. Anne looked at the woman carefully. She was pretty, tall and slender, with long black hair. Her breasts weren't very big, but she had slender legs. The woman had a good figure, but she seemed to have problems with her postpartum tummy. The 2 new children quickly disappeared into the crowd of other children playing. Anne thought this would be a good time to introduce herself. As she approached the couple, John turned to her. He said, It's good to see you again, Anne. I'd like to introduce you to my wife, Maria. The pretty woman held out her hand. Nice to meet you, Anne, she said. Anne replied, It's nice to meet you, Maria. John and you look good. Who are the 2 little ones that came with you? Maria replied, These are our children, William. He is 9 years old, and Serena, she is 11. They were so excited to come today. Neither John nor I have a big family. Thank you for letting us come. John added, I adopted and fostered them when we got married last year. Their father was killed in Afghanistan a few years ago. Anne smiled and touched John's arm. I know you've always wanted children. I'm happy for you, for both of you. Maria asked John to go check on the kids and bring her a plate of food. John looked at Anne. Can I get you something too? Anne shook her head and sat down next to Maria. Maria said, I'm sorry to send John away, but I've always wanted to meet you. John has told me so much about you. Maria touched Anne's arm. He said good things, Anne. He was so in love with you. I was jealous of you for a long time. And now? Anne asked. Maria smiled at Anne and answered, My jealousy turned to anger when he told me how you two broke up. I was angry because you hurt him, but then that was replaced with sadness when I realized the emptiness you left in him. He's the most wonderful man I've ever met, but I know he was once even better. I tried to put all the pieces of the mosaic together." Anne replied, "I'm really sorry. You can't imagine how much I wish I could change what I did, but you seem to have done a great job with it." Maria shook her head. "No work, Anne," she said. "I failed miserably. I tried to help him, but I wasn't the one who saved John. Your father was the greatest help to him. He always treated John as if he were his own son. But the real credit goes to William and Serena. The more time he spent with them, the more he came alive. Children won't let you hide inside yourself." Maria placed Anne's hand on her stomach. "He'll be a wonderful father to our next child," she said, and added before Anne could ask, "I'm 4 months pregnant." Anne hugged Maria. She told her, "I'm so happy you saved him. I never could forgive myself for what I did to him. The realization of what I did haunted me." Anne felt a weight lifted off her shoulders. She had been in therapy for over 4 years, but this one moment seemed to be the cure she had been looking for. Anne looked at Maria and added, "I have to tell you, not only did you put his mosaic together, you helped put me together as well." John soon returned with 2 plates of food. Anne's father followed John with the drinks. Anne asked her father, "Can you sit with us for a minute?" Anne's father replied, "Sure." Anne said, "There is one item left unresolved in the divorce. I think we need to settle it now." The father looked embarrassed. A half smile seemed to play on Maria's lips. Anne continued, "John, we are divorced, but I don't think we've resolved the issue with my family. I think we should have joint custody. You and now Maria and the children are part of that family." Dad laughed, stood up and hugged Anne. Maria cried as she also hugged Anne. John said, "Thank you." Anne replied, "Don't thank me. You don't know how hard work they can be." At that moment, Anne thought to herself, "Well, I may have lost a husband, but I gained a brother. There was a big difference in those kinds of love." Anne chuckled, thinking that Dr. Williams would enjoy talking about this the next time she had a therapy session. 3 days later, Anne thought back to meeting Maria and the kids as she drove to class. The breeze fluttering her hair was wonderful as she moved down the highway. She lowered the convertible top of Mary's car and turned up the radio louder.